Funding for this program is provided by the National Institute of Justice.
Residential punishment, 19 years, Texas Department of Corrections.
Hello, I'm James Wilson. The most important person in the criminal justice system may not be the judge, the police officer, or the prosecutor. It may be the victim. Without the victim, most crimes will not be reported. Without a victim, most suspects will not be identified. Without a victim, most cases cannot be made. Without a victim to testify, a criminal may go free. Moreover, it is the victim who bears most of the cost of crime. It is he or she who feels the loss of property, suffers the pain of an assault, the horror of a rape. Despite these losses and the victim's importance to the criminal justice system, only in the last few years has that system tried, in a serious way, to help the victim or assist him or her in playing a useful role in reducing crime and obtaining justice. Quite the contrary. Many times a citizen is victimized twice, once by the criminal and then by the criminal justice system. One such victim is Wanda Melton.
A typical Saturday night out to dinner, coming back to the apartment, not finding anything to eat, deciding or drink, and we decided to go down and have a last drink at a local pub. Went out, got in the car, and that was it. It happened.
28-year-old Wanda Melton of Annapolis, Maryland, was the innocent victim of a sniper attack. The assailant, a stranger, fired one shot from a Revolutionary War musket, hitting the car in which Wanda and her three friends were riding out on a double date.
It went through the rear window of the car, through the back seat, through me, through the front seat, and through Nancy, and then they dug it out of the dashboard of the car.
It was a real fluky thing. The guy who did it didn't know them. They're not sure still why he did it. They were both badly, badly injured, and it was a real nightmare. It was a real horror, and to this day they are carrying, I'm sure, emotional scars and certainly physical ones.
The driver of the car, Nancy Walton, was in a coma for over a month. She lost a lung and 2 ribs, but eventually recovered. Wanda Melton's left arm was shattered, the major nerves destroyed. 4 years later, after repeated surgery and hospital stays, Wanda continues to suffer and her arm remains partially paralyzed. Once a champion horsewoman, Wanda's life changed drastically as a result of the unprovoked attack.
I can no longer do the things that I used to do. Okay, I was very active. I worked a lot. I enjoyed being that active, and a lot of that has been taken away from me.
A 21-year-old man, saying he couldn't remember firing the shot, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of assault with attempt to murder. Robin Davenport runs the Maryland Victims Witness Assistance Program. She contacted the 2 women. Her job? To act as a liaison between the victim and prosecutor, providing counseling, guidance, and assistance in filling out a victim impact statement, a personal account of the effect the crime had on the victim.
It was presented to the judge. These impact statements were presented to the judge prior to the sentencing of the defendant, and he actually read from them.
Said that she sold real estate, rode horses, trained horses, did sailing, swimming, and many enjoyable activities. I loved life and enjoyed working. As a result of the shooting, these things are a part of my past.
I think it's the only way the judge really gets to hear the victim's side of it. We did not testify at the trial. We just sat there.
I think it very forcefully set forth the agony the woman went through, the manner in which her life has been devastated by this crime, the expenses that she has incurred, the psychological effect of having been shot, the depression that she goes through on a day-to-day basis, the suffering that she endures, and that's all part of the mix in determining what disposition ought to be made in any criminal case.
Judge Getty sentenced the defendant to the maximum term, 30 years in prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 7 years.
You go through this whole thing of where, well, wait a minute, I just devoted 8 months of interviews and time and being led by the hand to going to court so this person could get punished for what he's going to do, and I've just found out that all that time I put into it is going to get him 7 years after they've just stood there and told me that it's going to be 30?
As a result of the shooting, Wanda was out of work for over 3 years. To make ends meet, she had remortgaged her house, sold her car, spent her savings, and relied heavily on friends and family. Seeking financial aid, Wanda contacted the Maryland Criminal Injuries Compensation Board.
If they have a serious financial hardship and they meet all the requirements, then they would receive an award.
You have to research it out. You have to fill out tons and tons and tons of paperwork. I was cold stone sober about what I was entering, and therefore every time I hit another dead end was so devastated, psychologically devastated, that it makes you want to give up.
Wanda had no medical insurance. The compensation board paid all her medical bills directly to the hospital, but it was years before she received any living expenses.
I was given, I think, about $37,000. But the thing that you have to understand is that it took almost 4 years to get this money, and 3 of those years were non-productive years where I was in this house and I was not working. I had no income. So meanwhile, everybody was paying my bills.
We couldn't put her back together, but we gave her the maximum that we could under the circumstances.
The paperwork, the time, the frustration. The criminal, as far as I'm concerned, has more rights at this point than the victim, and has always had.
We're not there yet. We're definitely not there yet. Slowly, legislatively and otherwise, we are getting there. But the victims are really, and witnesses are really very legitimate in their feeling that defendants' rights are being more protected than their own.
Here to discuss this is Marlene Young, Executive Director of the National Organization for Victim Assistance, Lois Haight Harrington, Assistant Attorney General, United States Department of Justice, and Norman Early, District Attorney from Denver, Colorado. Lois, you were the chairman of the President's Task Force on Victims of Crime. You've been over this ground. Why is it that Wanda Melton and the Wanda Meltons of this world could feel that the criminal has more rights than the victim?
Well, we simply haven't been giving attention to the victim. You know, when we went to law school almost 20 years ago, we never mentioned the word victim. I don't think most of the judges, many of the people in policymaking in criminal justice were even aware of this concept of victimization. It's a lot of ignorance. We have to realize this is the person society was formed to protect, this innocent person.
Now, we know, as people active in the criminal justice system, without victim cooperation, it's hard to make a case.
That's
you would think,
right.
therefore, there would be a practical reason for helping victims just to get the system to work. What prevents that from happening?
Ignorance. People simply have not drawn that connection. They have not realized, gee, if I don't treat the victim better, they may not cooperate. On our task force, over 50% of the victims that came forward said, I will never cooperate again. I was treated so poorly. And we know from the Bureau of Justice Statistics study on the victimization survey, by the way, which was with the Census Bureau, that over 50% of violent crime is not even reported. The victims say they want to cut their losses. They don't want to get involved. They've seen what's happened to their friends and their loved ones. So we have got to treat them better to get their cooperation.
Now, changes have occurred.
Yes.
The states are adopting new programs. What are the states doing in general terms?
Well, given an idea, just to give an idea of what's happened, about 2 years ago, about 6 states had some legislation on victims other than compensation. Now approximately 27. That is a real start. But some of these states are working on protecting the victim, enforcing the intimidation and harassment, providing separate waiting rooms for the victim so they don't have to wait with the defendant or the defendant's family. They're working on sentencing so the victim would have an impact statement or have a right to explain to the court the consequences of the crime. They're working on laws for continuances so that the victim can support the defendant's right to a speedy trial and get the case behind them and get on with their lives. There's a lot of individual laws. I don't think any state has a panacea yet, but they are making some progress.
Does the federal government have any role to play in this? Has it tried to do anything?
Yes, it has. And I think that the task force, of course, provided leadership and provided information and made people aware of the problem, because I think people, once aware of the problem, will work on solutions. And then we also have the Victims of Crime Act of 1984, which actually provides support to the states. And this is up to $100 million in federal criminal fines, not innocent taxpayers' dollars, to be made available to the states for their state victim compensation programs and for their state victim assistance programs.
I mean, the fines collected in federal court are then put back into the states to fund these compensation programs.
That's right.
Now, we heard Wanda Melton say that she felt that she'd put in 8 months of her life for a person who may have destroyed her life to get 7 years in prison. Mm-hmm. Is that normal, do you think? Is that the standard scenario you see around the country?
That was a standard scenario we heard almost everywhere. And I think it's important to realize a concept behind the President's comprehensive crime bill that he signed in law in October to abolish parole at the federal level. Because what we found out, that the public was being deceived. And there was abuse of discretion also. The legislators had passed laws which seemingly are tough enough. We felt also in the task force they were. But once a parole system got involved, then the laws seem to be meaningless. And we're trying to do a parole with a supervision which we know does not work, and rehabilitation in a controlled artificial situation which we know we cannot predict for behavior. It is an antiquated system, and it must be abolished. There must be truth in sentencing.
Thank you. Let me turn to Marlene Young for a moment. You're the director of the National Organization for Victims Assistance, and you heard the story by Wanda Melton. She was the beneficiary of a victims assistance program in the prosecutor's office, and she also applied for compensation from the state of Maryland. Now, in general terms, she seemed to be more satisfied with the assistance that the prosecutor's office gave her than she was with the compensation. What do you think prevents compensation programs around the country from working as well as victims seem to like?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. There's certainly a problem to begin with of public awareness that compensation programs exist and that they are available so that those people can apply. That's one problem that certainly affects them.
Is there any way to deal with that without making people apply for programs for which they might not be eligible? For example, take a typical state and tell me, if I were the victim of a crime, under what circumstances would I be eligible for some kind of compensation?
Well, in general, you have to be a victim of a physical injury crime, which Wanda was. You have to have suffered a physical injury. And then you may be eligible as a result of that physical injury for a number of kinds of benefits, ranging from hospital and medical care to reimbursement for lost wages, perhaps funeral expenses for survivors of people who have been murdered, as well as in some states, a few that provide for mental health counseling for the emotional trauma that accompanies that kind of physical injury.
But I'm not eligible for state money for simply pain and suffering to compensate me for the crime. That has to be an out-of-pocket expense. Is that correct?
In most states. There are a few that do provide some compensation for pain and suffering, but the majority of them do not. And where they do provide that compensation, in most cases, it's limited to victims of sexual assault.
I see. Now I know when I'm eligible for compensation, but if Wanda Melton's story is representative of that of other people around the country, many people who are aware of this program still feel dissatisfied. What else is going on here?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of red tape that is often involved in compensation programs because of a number of concerns by legislators and other public policy makers about fraud and abuse with victim claims, as well as concern about checking out those people who apply for the benefits, whether they be medical beneficiaries or funeral directors. There's been a lot of paperwork that has come between the victim and the ultimate award. And that's exactly what Wanda was talking about. In some states, that limits the awards to, say, 4 or 5 years after the crime, the victim receiving them. And
is there any way of shortening that period, cutting through the red tape? Are there any groups working on that problem?
Well, I think that there are ways. Our organization, as advocates for victims, and a number of state organizations are trying to work with compensation boards to facilitate that by shortening forms and eliminating unneeded bureaucracy, investigations, and other kinds of issues.
How is your organization funded?
Well, the majority of our funding right now comes from the Department of Justice, but we also have funding from the National Institute of Mental Health, as well as membership dues, and we have a small amount of corporate and foundation donations.
And do you see this as a program that is going to result eventually in everyone having a right or an entitlement to some kind of compensation if they're the victim of a violent crime that injures them, and if, for example, they must pay medical or hospital expenses? Is this where we're headed in general?
Well, I think that's one small part of it. our organization is dedicated to seeing that both rights, privileges, and services are available to victims of crime, not only to deal with financial injury such as compensation, but also to deal with their physical injury and rehabilitation, as well as what we think is perhaps the most important aspect, the emotional pain and injury which follows the crime as a result of the crime itself, but almost more importantly as a result of what we call the second injury, what society does to the victim in the aftermath of crime.
Is there any other country in the world that has gone this far with respect to victim assistance?
Well, I think that, if you look at Western Europe and Canada, you can see a number of countries that have provided compensation for victims of crime, and they also have different kinds of judicial systems which make it somewhat difficult to compare. For instance, in France, the victim is actually a part of the criminal justice proceeding. They are involved in that situation, and they become, in essence, a litigant, because France merges civil and criminal remedies.
Let me interrupt you on that very point and turn to a prosecutor, Norman Early from Denver. You saw in the case we just heard about, Wanda Melton, the judge taking into account her written statement in deciding on the sentence. Is that the role the victim ought to play in the criminal justice system as a participant in determining the sentence?
I think the victim very definitely has a role in determining the sentence. I think that any sentence that is given without a complete understanding of the trauma which the victim has suffered is not an appropriate sentence. Traditionally, in the criminal justice system, the judge has full knowledge of the defendant's background, the defendant's character, sometimes where the defendant even went to elementary school, in making a decision as to what kind of sentence this individual should receive. Certainly as much attention should be devoted to the problems suffered by the innocent victim.
Now, when you prosecute somebody in Denver, you prosecute them on behalf of the people of Colorado. You represent the people. What we're now hearing is the suggestion that the victim ought to play a role in this. Is there some way of drawing a philosophical or practical boundary where between your function as representing the people and the state on the one hand and your role perhaps as representing the victim?
I think that when we adequately represent victims, we do represent the people of the state. One of the problems that I see in the criminal justice system is because we are representative of the people, oftentimes the victim takes a back seat. And it is incumbent upon us as prosecutors to understand that the better we treat victims, the better our cases will be, and also to understand that victims who are innocent victims of crime should be treated well simply for the sake of treating them well, that they should not be further traumatized by a criminal justice system that does not understand them.
Do most prosecutors feel as you do about this?
I can't say that most of them do, because many prosecutors in the country do not even have any remnants of a victim program. The fact of the matter is that I've been very active in the victims movement, and I have the same background that many other prosecutors do. All of us who went to law school, like Lois was saying, never heard the word victim. Not only that, though, we also came to understand that you jealously guard the rights of defendants, and you do not transgress upon those rights, and if you do, there are sanctions. So we as prosecutors have to retrain ourselves in terms of our thinking to understand that it is not our position simply to guard the rights of the defendant, that our responsibility is to the society as a whole and to that victim, and to try to put that victim in an appropriate role in the criminal justice system.
I am puzzled because the participation of the victim in the criminal justice system is essential to getting a conviction, even to bringing a case in the first instance in many cases. And yet you say prosecutors often don't even have the rudimentary elements of a victim assistance program. Why is it that they don't connect up the importance of the victim to them as prosecutors with the advantages of providing some assistance to victims?
I think much of it stems from tradition. Victims have generally come to court. You did not have the widespread feeling on the part of victims that they're not going to participate. As Lois says, 50% of them say, I simply won't participate. In the past, victims, because of obligation, because of duty, because of a sense of justice, felt that they must participate in the criminal justice system. And when you have an individual that's going to participate in the system and do their best, regardless of how you treat them, you tend not to treat them very well. It is only since victims groups have started agitating for better treatment of victims of crime have we come to understand that the victim is the most important person in the criminal justice system, and without the victim, the prosecutor cannot secure a victory. We tend to do things tomorrow the way we did them yesterday. Lawyers tend to be conservative, and prosecutors tend to be the most conservative of lawyers. And for that reason, a routine builds in, and it's more because of inertia than anything else, that a lot of people have not truly devoted themselves to the problem.
Let me ask you about the position of the victim at the stage of sentencing. In your judgment, does the victim tend to produce a statement that results in a more severe sentence, a less severe sentence, or the same sentence? What is the general consequence of having the victims involved?
Before the victim impact statement became as commonly used as it is, we used to invite victims to sentencing in order to allocute. You would be surprised at the extremely small number of individuals who actually came to court in order to express their sentiments to the judge. I think there may have been a frustration level there at that time or whatever, but they did not come into court that frequently. Generally when they did, it was on a sensational case, and it was on a case that the victim had a tremendous amount of feeling about. Oftentimes it did not alter the judge's sentence one way or another, in talking with judges very candidly about the impact that it had. One thing that it did do is I believe that it completed the process for the victim and made the victim feel as if though there was some finality to it and that they had participated in it to its final extent.
Lois, what remains to be done? What is the unfinished agenda with respect to the victim's role in the criminal justice system?
Oh, there's so many myths to be dispelled. My mind spins thinking about them. Just on what Norm was saying and what you were talking about made me think of the fact, wait, we're not pressuring justice. We're trying to aid in its attainment. I mean, we want the victims to explain the consequences of the crime so the judge can do justice. I think dispelling that kind of ignorance that we're trying to pressure, or that the victim would come in with some sort of vengeful motive, is wrong. I think that the fact that we've treated our child victims so terribly, that we have this paradox in our system, that if the youngster is the offender, we have a whole separate juvenile justice system that takes care of them and they're behind closed doors and everything is in their best interest. If that same child is the victim, they're put in that same age, they're put in a system with no protections whatsoever. They're treated 10 times worse. I think we have to look very hard at our bail laws for protecting the victims. We've done this on the federal level now, as you know, in the new comprehensive crime bill. I think each state must look through this.
Are you suggesting that there's a great deal of intimidation of victims or witnesses by persons who have been accused of a crime?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And almost every criminal that we talked to, by the way, in the task forces, said, listen, I had nothing to lose. If I intimidated and harassed that victim, they weren't going to come forward, then I'm off scot-free. And even if they did come forward, even if by chance, on the strongest chance, I was convicted, the judge was going to give me a sentence the same as he was on the original crime. I had nothing to lose. These are the kind of things we have to tidy up. We have to protect our victim. We have to make it difficult for the criminal to have this type of influence and pressure that they do. We're not talking about taking away the rights of the criminal, but we are talking about balancing the system.
Marlene, a lot of people, perhaps yourself included, when they speak about the plight of victims, use the phrase victims' rights. You've used that phrase yourself. What do you mean by victims' rights? Where do they come from? What do they consist of?
Well, I think it's what we believe should happen, is that the victim should have some basic ways to access the criminal justice system and receive appropriate treatment, and that you can translate those into specific issues, some that Lois and Norm have both mentioned. A right to protection, for instance, we feel is very much due to the victim, a right to information, a right to counsel, a right to get their property back, have employment maintained, a right to reparations, a right to due process that is similar to the rights that offenders have. It's simply a question of trying to define and sustain equal justice.
Let me play the devil's advocate. At the risk of sounding like Scrooge or a heartless enemy of victims, some people have suggested that this is a society that's drowning in rights, that everybody has rights and nobody has any responsibilities. If we now equip victims with a whole set of new rights, does that mean victims are going to start suing prosecutors because their rights have been violated? Cases are going to be thrown out because the victims' rights weren't protected?
Well, I think that there is a distinction in some senses on a practical basis. As a victim advocate, I can speak of rights for victims because that makes it very clear exactly what I'm talking about. In most states, those rights, where they have been enacted, as they were, have been enacted more in the set of fair standards to establish some equal treatment for the victim. And in every state that has passed a Bill of Rights, they've said specifically it does not have a remedy in terms of litigation against the public prosecutor or the public police, etc. And so in one sense, what we're doing is try to establish these standards for fair treatments, defining them that way, and providing those standards so that they can afford that treatment to the victim, but not necessarily to get into a litigation issue.
Norm, do you think of the role of the victim as something that's best determined or defined in terms of rights, or would you prefer the term standards?
I have no difficulty with the word rights. I understand that some prosecutors do, and there's the feeling that if you give victims rights and their true rights, then they will have the right to sue the prosecutor if those rights are not granted. I suspect that most states that have enacted legislation have dealt with this issue as to whether they should characterize them as rights, and I think that most states have gone ahead and done so. What you're really talking about is a mindset here, whether you're going to equate rights of defendants with rights of victims and try to bring some balance between the two. Because if you're talking about rights of defendants and standards for victims, then that really doesn't have the impact in terms of terminology, in my estimation.
You've mentioned the differences between your practice and that of many other practices often enough to lead me to believe that you may be an unusual prosecutor. Is that a fair statement?
Let me say that I was the unit chief of our victim witness program in the Denver District Attorney's Office before becoming district attorney some years ago. And because of that experience, I was fully ensconced in the victim rights movement and feel very strongly about treating people better within this criminal justice system. A lot of prosecutors have not had the experience that I've had vis-a-vis victims and have not seen some of the horrors that I've seen.
What if I go to my prosecutor and say, I think we ought to have in this county a strong victims' rights program or victim standards program, and he says back to me, well, that's very fine, Jim, but it's going to cost a lot of money and I don't have it. What should I say to him?
Sometimes it is a resource issue for prosecutors, and you have to understand that. In some instances, when a resource issue is named as a reason for not starting a program, it's really a matter of priorities, whether you can pull from here and institute something there. There are a lot of prosecutors in this country who have very excellent victims programs and who have done so without securing federal funding or funding from the states. Most states are starting to make it easy for us because they are passing some legislation that calls for some kind of victim assistance program. Plus, Lois has already indicated that the federal government is now going to be giving money that is coming from fines to states for victims programs. And it will be much easier for prosecutors who feel that the resources preclude them from actually initiating programs and doing a better job on behalf of victims. But it seems to me, even if you don't buy into the concept that victims should be treated better just because they should be, any prosecutor who walks into a courtroom and pulls an individual from a hallway whom they just met 10 minutes earlier and puts them on a witness stand, or regardless of how much earlier they met them, if you don't have a rapport with that individual, that's something that the jury is going to see. And that's something that's going to make a case worse than it could be.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you out there for joining us for Crime File. I'm James Wilson.
Funding for this program was provided by the National Institute of Justice. This program was produced by the Police Foundation, which is solely responsible for its content.